So we're going to, as Randy introduced, kind of do a couple things here. We're going to start with some general overview of high impact practices. At least I'll start with that. And then we'll move into Ken actually doing a little bit more around the institutional integration aspect and really focus attention a lot more on institutional action and perhaps why this work is so challenging. And then we're going to transition. We'll do a little breakout group time for you to formulate your ideas, and we hope you can formally participate in that breakout session. And we do have a little assignment for you, so please know that's coming. And then we'll shift a little bit more to the new information that we are revealing in the high impact practice book, Delivering on the Promise of High Impact Practices. And that will be out in July. So that will be part of the promotional activities going on. Although I suppose all of this is very promotional in some respects. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen to get us to focus some of our attention on that promotion. And I'll just begin by trying to focus your attention again on some of the incredible resources and materials that have been developed over the years now to support the work on high impact practices and equity. So we are, centering this talk on really thinking about high impact practices as a site for institutional integration. And we mean that in the broadest sense of integrating HIPS more directly and distinctively in the curriculum, in the co-curriculum, and then as a site for people and units and offices to better integrate their work, and as a place to foster and create opportunities for integrated learning, which it really is a hallmark of high impact practices. So integration is a great word. It's probably one of my favorites. Intentionality, integration, I could probably go off on all of the I words that I really like, but integration is a really important one. And I think for all of this work to go well, we have to focus on the integrative elements of our practice. So with that, I'll try and scroll through a bunch of slides here and again, focus our attention on what we know about high impact practices. And I'll probably do this at a little bit of 1.5 podcast speed, just because I feel like many of us are familiar with this information, so I won't belabor it too much. But most of you are now way beyond familiar. In fact, it's probably one of the most accessed resources on the AAC&U site. I know it's one that is significantly tabbed and dog-eared on my own library shelf and in all of the PDF versions I have of it. The 2008 publication, High Impact Practices, that really defined and set the stage for this work. Not only did it describe all the high impact practices, but really laid the groundwork and provided the body of evidence about why high impact practices are so effective. So if you haven't familiarized yourself or know this publication perhaps as well as I do, I invite you to think and pause on it and think about it a little bit more. But essentially, to distill it down to its key points, it noted and provided evidence for the value of participating in high impact practices, but also pointed out the really important distinction that while underserved students, historically underserved students, those who are first in their family to go to college, those of underrepresented racial identity groups, students who entered institutions with lower entering board scores. I know just one marker of underserved students, but an important one, that they benefited more when they participated in high impact practices. And there was at that point defined as a compensatory, although I've kind of shifted away from that word to be more of a salutary effect for underrepresented students. Yet the pause at that moment was also, these are the same groups of students who are underrepresented as participants in HIPS. So how do we, raise the bar in both the quality of the presentation and making sure that more students get to experience these, but also really attend to the access issues. So, just to point to one piece of evidence that I think still holds true, It's the work that Cal State Northridge did from their institutional research team that discovered that when Latino students in particular, this graph illustrates, participated in 2 HIPs, you can see that the red bar on the left for Latino students is the same as the gray bar for number 2 for not Latino students. So indicating both are very close here, 65 versus 68% graduation rates. So while when they have 0 HIPs, you can see the wild difference. Once they are Latino students in this case have at least 2, their graduation rates are almost on par with not Latino students. So this was a significant piece of evidence that Cal State Northridge was tracking that was very persuasive. And there are other institutions that have replicated these data. So the subsequent take on this work was a much deeper inventory of institutional practices and a greater emphasis on ensuring quality and taking high impact practices to scale. So in this 2013 publication, we saw even kind of a double down on these practices, but also making sure that we're, again, paying attention to equity and scale. And what I really liked about this publication is it elaborated on the qualities that make high impact practices so effective. So if you're not familiar with the quality list, I actually, see if I can talk and do this at the same time. I actually have the HIP qualities as a link, and that is a significant resource, I think, in terms of, no, wait, my copy did not work. Hold on one second. I'm not that adept, apparently. This quality list, I think if you're not familiar with it, I put it in the chat, is one that's worth reviewing because it's going to be the emphasis and the next components that I'm going to describe. And I always think it's worth revisiting this because if you maybe have not reviewed it for some time, don't quite remember what does it mean to deliver these practices at a level of high quality, this is a great reminder about that. And it's very focused on educational practice. So I like this list. So let me move on to the more recent review that really honored the high impact practices when they turned 10. This publication actually is from 2017, and it was a review in Change magazine that again elaborated on the 8 key features and really brought us up to, at that point, the latest in high impact practices in terms of what we know about them and how widespread they are. So, all right, that's a very quick overview of its really history since 2008 when they were more formally debuted in that publication from AAC&U. And since then, we've continued to see, I think, an expansion of enthusiasm for practices that are identified as high impact, that we continue to see the salutary benefits, that there are even more people getting on board, including employers. Faculty widely agree that HIPs are exciting and things they want to participate in. We've seen more centers for engaged learning or centers for high impact practices develop at institutions. And institutions have claimed the importance of these practices. Now, anytime anything gets attention like this, we all know this happens in higher education, with it comes more scrutiny, more questions, more critique. You're subject to criticism whenever you start to promote something as, well, I would never declare it a panacea. It certainly starts to take on that level of importance, and people are notably and appropriately concerned that we might be dedicating too much attention, or how do we know this is really all it's packed up, all that it's expected, if it's delivering on all that, and also is it really serving all of our students in ways that are equitable. So I think that scrutiny and that critique, those critiques are worth considering, and I don't shy away from them. However, I think it means that as practitioners, as educators, we do need to double down on our efforts to ensure quality and equity, not only to respond to those critiques and concerns, but also just to make sure that we're continuing to enhance and improve our practice. So for me, the current work in high impact practices is very much about assuring quality and equity. So I see these as twin perspectives. To me, they are a constant kind of caution that I think we need to exercise. And it's one that George Koo, as a founder, has always raised, that in order to do HIPs to their full promise, we need to make sure we're doing them well. Just naming something a HIP doesn't make it so. Quality and implementation matter. And then to get back to the high impact practice equity issue, we know there are inequities in access and participation, and we know there are likely concerns for racially minoritized students who are in these practices in terms of the overall quality of their experience and some other concerns that I'll raise here as we move through this. So if we're going to do this, we need to do it well. You're all here, I think, in an institute to improve your high impact practices, and that's what Ken and I hope to do today is point you to some of the things that you might take up to do that. So again, I'm going to refer to these 8 qualities several times, so you may as well get pretty familiar with them. And the key question for me is always, all right, if high impact practices are all about these particular dimensions, these elements, how do we know that these things are happening? Can we all point to how much investment of time and effort these high impact practices require of our students? Can we all say where in our HIP it invites students to engage with difference, and that we know that that's done with fidelity, and that all students are gaining from that experience? Where do we know that there are opportunities, intentional opportunities for students to integrate their learning? So to me, these are all dimensions that we always have to ask and be assured that we're attending to. Now, as a survey research operation, we decided, hey, we should ask students about these experiences to really determine if the HIPs they were saying they were in are delivering on these qualities. So as a survey operation, no surprise, the National Survey of Student Engagement devised a survey to ask students who were in a HIP that they specified if they were doing these things and the degree to them. Now, I'm not going to go over this whole presentation today. It's a really, it's an hours-long presentation in and of itself, but I'm going to refer you just to the resource that we developed. It's a comprehensive report, and I'll put these in the chat as we kind of go here for your reference. But this comprehensive report details our extensive examination of these high impact practices. Now with more than 20,000 students, we've done this again. And in 2002, we just finished a more recent data collection where we'll again examine these qualities in high impact practices. But we thought, students are very reliable reporters on what they are experiencing, particularly if you ask them questions that they can reasonably answer about how frequently they do these things, whether they did certain kinds of interaction with their faculty or peers. We asked them a battery of about 48 questions that got into a lot more detail about their high impact practices. So I'm going to skip right to the punchline here. What did we learn about students, the particular high impact practice, and students' appreciation and experiences and exposure to these qualities? Well, the first thing we did was we looked at whether the qualities were being experienced by students in terms of the levelness with the dimensions that were and the patterns that were already emphasized in the literature. So as many of you know, there's a distinct body of literature and evidence for all of these practices. And the learning community literature has one batch of evidence, the capstone experience has another, service learning has a very robust evidence base for practice. And they all have different patterns in terms of what they represent. Well, our students reporting behaviors and experiences and exposure based on these patterns that we see in the literature. And here's the very quick answer to that. Yes, in general, we did. Students were reporting engagement with difference, interaction with their peers, interaction with their faculty in ways that the literature suggested these high impact practices emphasized. I know that's a very shorthand conclusion to offer you, but I'll refer you to the full report if you want to see more about every hip in particular, but in general, the patterns held. Now, is there variability in the proportion of students who experience high quality on these elements, where they're emphasized in the literature? Yes, this is where we see the variability. So it's important that we consider where we see this variability, and I'll show you here in a moment. But first, I want to just show you the range and scope that we see by hip. Now, this is really boiling it down to one single number, which is actually quite incredible when you think about the number of dimensions, 8, that we had and the number of questions in it. We devised a regular or just a standard measure of quality for each of the hips. And you'll see the lineup of 7 hips along the bottom. And then the range of the variability of the quality score in each of those is indicated by the single line, the vertical line, and these are traditional box and whisker charts. So first year seminar has a lot of variability in quality, in contrast to undergraduate research and internships and study abroad, where we see a tighter band around the quality dimension. So those would be considered, those 3 would be considered the most consistent high quality in terms of the patterns in the literature. So you can see the mean scores are indicated here. And again, I don't want to belabor this point, but you can see there's variation among the hips first. That's my main point, but not as much there as there is in variability in the quality dimensions themselves. So where we see more variability in the proportion of students who experience the high quality on these elements are in opportunities to reflect, where it ranges from 34% exposure to 61% exposure, to opportunities to integrate. Remember, I already declared that my favorite dimension, 27 to 57%. And then engagement across difference is the saddest, I think, in terms of 9% exposure to 66% exposure, where we see much tighter and exposure and very little variability is around high expectations for performance. So we're doing well in terms of expressing and ensuring that students are getting that high expectation for their performance. 85 to 91%, it's pretty amazing that we deliver that hip quality at that level, and public demonstration of competence. So when students are doing a presentation or some sort of formal write-up of their work, that we're doing to a pretty high degree of fidelity in terms of that particular element. Another dimension of quality is students were overall satisfied with their hips. So students like these experiences, which is always a good thing for, I think, for educators to be able to know, is that students enjoy doing these. So it suggests that we still have some opportunities here to improve the quality of our high impact practices. So to me, this is a really important dimension when we're thinking about how do we improve implementation, and the work that I presume you're trying to do through this institute is that labeling something a high impact practice does not in and of itself assure high impact. We need to think about the qualities and how they're expressed, how they're highlighted, how they're delivered, how they're organized in the high impact practice. And we need to intentionally design with these qualities in mind if we want to make sure that HIPs are really the high impact practices that we declare. So that's my take. Okay, I'll go back and just take a breath and pause here around the quality dimension. So this is what we've learned about the quality elements. And I think there's a lot to suggest is still needed around improving our educational practice. And I hope as I went through those, you started to think about either how do you know that those quality dimensions exist in the HIPs that you're working on? And then also, how might you design those more intentionally into the HIPs that you are doing? So that's one question. Now, I want to shift to the equity consideration, because I do think that this is even more germane to the work that you're doing as part of the Equity Institute. It's been noticed in since we've been tracking participation in high impact practices, that we still have an underrepresentation challenge. The simple prescription that George Koo offered in 2007, actually, when we were describing the value of HIPS, that all students do at least 2. We still aren't even achieving that bar. And to me now, this is a rather low bar. We still see across NESE every year that about 58% of first-year students did at least 1. 60% of seniors completed at least 2. It's been actually pretty flat, as you can see by this simple bar graph on the right. And you know, the saddest to me is that there's still a 15% annually of seniors who didn't participate in any high impact practices that we see. So there's still some opportunity here to reach all populations of students. So this gives you a general sense of our penetration and students' exposure to HIPS. Now, the one that is more important, I think, to look at is when we start to examine biracial identity groups. And here we see some more stark differences in terms of participation rates. And I'm just going to illustrate with 2 high impact practices, one internships and the second being research with faculty or undergraduate research. Internships, there's a 10% gap between Black and African American students and Latinx students and all other students. And for research with faculty, it's a little bit less. I think this one's kind of interesting to think about, perhaps the impact of equal opportunity and undergraduate research opportunity programs that have been initiated at many campuses to make research with faculty a little more equitable. But we see these gaps across racial identity groups or across gender identity, sexual orientation, and we've noted these differences in several years of NESE publications. Now, nobody's done this better in terms of talking about it and really stimulating our attention to this than Ashley Finley and Tia McNair, who produced Assessing Underserved Student Engagement in HIPS in 2013. Tia continues to talk about this in all of her work. The real challenge to equity in HIPS has to do with existing deficit-minded campus practices. She's really put her finger on the idea that there's still inequities around how students get access to these experiences, that things that we've structured in the educational experience don't allow students to participate, that there's a lot of opportunities or occasions where students lack information, don't have the funds, they lack advice from their faculty or from advisors who might be able to help them get access to these opportunities. So they've done a wonderful job kind of pinpointing the deficit-minded practices that continue to make this a barrier for students. The other aspect, though, that I think we need to think about is every institution has their own built-in assumptions, biases, inequitable policies that are related to high-impact practices that ultimately end up harming marginalized students' participation. I think we can use an asset-based framework to examine what is making it possible for the students who are racially identified, who are participating with different racialized identities. What is making it possible for them to participate? I like that asset-based framework. And who and what has been supportive is a good examination to do. But we still have to examine, I think, this idea of what's inhibiting students' participation. So there's a lot more we need to do around this. We need to spend a lot more time thinking about it. We've spent some more time looking at racially minoritized students' exposure to HIPS. And I'm not going to I'm already exceeding my time, and I want to make sure that we have sufficient time to get at this a little bit more, but I'll refer you to a publication that we did that's available through Change Magazine that expands our understanding of racially minoritized students' experiences in HIPS and really focuses on new dimensions that were important to students who are participating in HIPS with racialized identities, that they saw making a difference for others as being critical and a really important element in their HIP, and really developing a sense of agency and accomplishment as being one of the most important qualities in their high impact practices. So I'm going to stop there and let us move on to the next phase or the next aspect of our work, and let Ken move on to that part.
Sounds good, Jillian. And if you stop, that's it. Thank you very much. And I'm going to start sharing my screen. And you're going to have what Randy referred to earlier as a sixth sense moment, because my screen is blank, but I'm going to fill it with stuff in just a second. To get you your bearings, Jillian did run just a couple of minutes over, but really we're right on track for what we wanted to do. What you just heard, that state of the field, is really important. Brett asked in the chat about, yeah, but what can campuses do about it, which was a perfect setup for my part of this presentation period. At the end of about 5 or 10 minutes of hearing from me, we're going to ask that Randy and Helen put you into randomly assigned Zoom breakout groups. It looks like we've got about 60 connections participating, so 10 rooms should do it for the size that we were looking for. We'll give you 10 minutes to practice one technique among yourselves, and then we'll bring you back for some more interactive dives into the book. As I think about the answer to Brett's question, what can institutions do about it? My first advice is know your enemy. And in our case, the enemy is many of the business structures we all inherited to deliver higher education. So I'm going to zoom out just a little bit from the questions that Jillian raised about high impact practices to ask, how was it that we got to this point? Why are we in such a mess? Why is what Jillian just described so very hard to do at an institution level? Our origin myth in higher education begins in the Middle Ages. As a lot of you know, universities founded in the 1100s in Europe, curating and transmitting the knowledge that had been held in the Mideast for the most part during the Dark Ages. Our big inflection point came in the 19th century. We had essentially the sons of the elite coming to college to prepare for a wider range of occupations. So instead of just medicine, theology, and law, as we saw in the Middle Ages, we were adding things like engineering and agriculture and business. That conception of higher ed is more relevant for how we work today, but it's still pretty distant from the world as we now experience it, where there are interactions with people from different groups, there's interactions with technology, there's a very, very different and more complicated set of problems to solve. And yet, in many ways, this should come as good news to us, because the world now looks more than ever like the one we evolved in, to solve complicated, unscripted problems in groups. In other words, we are, more than any other species, one that learns collectively and socially. We are in our element when you hit us with something that threatens our survival, for which the answer is not known. And if you arrange these chronologically, you see that that style of learning, that messy, unscripted style of learning, has been the case for us as a species for almost all of our history, where learning was personal, opportunistic, improvised, and above all, social. And it's only when you get to the very, very recent history of that arc that we took an assembly line or factory model to learning and essentially fought against our own better natures with how we deliver education, where suddenly the name of the game was make it impersonal, standardize it, make it about remembering the right answer or finding it at the back of the book, and above all, make it solitary. Until very recently, the word we had for group work was cheating. That's how strongly we felt that this was something where if we could just isolate and take out all of the messy social variables, we'd have learning in its pure form. And what we got instead was anything but. And yet, in our defense, that's because we had a crush of 20 million students at the college and university level in this country to educate. You can't be messy, unscripted, and improvisational at this kind of scale. But as a result, we're not doing very well, as many of you know. Half our students graduate from the college where they began, another 11% transfer and then graduate. And the others are either still trying to do it 6 years later or have disappeared altogether. And as you know, in particular at this conference, the numbers are even worse. for students from groups that have always been shafted. And I would argue this is the price we pay, these low success rates, these glaring inequities, when we fight against our own nature for how we're supposed to learn, how we're set up to do learning. When you trade it all away for an assembly line model, these are the results you get. And I'm not the only one feeling this way. This is from a few years ago. What was once a challenge of quantity in American undergraduate education, of enrolling as many students as possible, mission accomplished, man, we did that. Now it's a challenge of educational quality. That's what we get for our deal with the devil. Since coming from the system office to CSU Dominguez Hills, I have seen this firsthand. I'm going to share with you our dirty laundry. These are our graduation rates. We are overwhelmingly minority serving, first generation Pell eligible. And so our gaps look pretty good because really all our students are from the populations that aren't well served. This is relative to targets that the state of California gave each of the CSU campuses to improve graduation rates. Each campus got a different set based on who it serves. Dominguez Hills is in the southern part of Los Angeles, serving Compton, Watts, other neighborhoods that are challenged. And so our targets are ambitious for us, but not for other institutions. They would put us just a little bit higher than our category generally, where we, for the most part, already are. But notice the exception. The one we're having trouble with is the 4-year graduation rates for our newly minted incoming freshmen. So to address that one, we have thrown a lot of spaghetti at the wall. Summer programs, summer bridge, a lot of the interventions that many of you have tried. These are expensive interventions. And we want to know if they're working. And we want to see if we can somehow go against all those inherited structures of the last century and a half, and instead get to a more natural, fundamental, and effective mode for student learning. And that means thinking about our organization at the campus level in a different way. Most of us are familiar with the verticality of the org chart in academic affairs. That verticality characterizes other divisions as well. Resisting all of that isolation and fostering the kind of integration that you heard Jillian espouse and that I know is one of the cornerstones of this institute are things like institutional policy and all these other interventions that cut horizontally across the institution. And most valuably, for an administrator, believe it or not, are the cross-cutting learning outcomes. And in that intersection between vertical and horizontal, as hard as it is to affect, you get the positive outcomes that all of us stand for. I love this diagram. I use it all the time, so I have to confess it is not mine. At Jennifer Coip's recommendation, I swiped it from this copy of Liberal Education about 15 years ago, but I certainly encourage you with attribution to use it too. I think it's a really good, pithy way to answer the question Brett raised. What do you need to do on a campus? The short answer is you need to overcome centrifugal force. You have to bring people together in ways that their org chart alone doesn't dictate. The next 2 slides, I'm not going to belabor, but they have really killer attributions on them, also from projects here and colleagues here. I didn't find these on my own, but they underscore that integration and equity go hand in hand. Here's the big blueprint for how you do this at an institutional level as we're learning it at Dominguez Hills. And I will tell you, this is such a work in progress. I don't mean to declare victory by any means, but we are bringing together a HIPS task force that includes some campus leadership. We're doing a comprehensive inventory of everything on the campus that might be a HIP. And then we're asking the group, who are the likeliest suspects to actually be accessible for the outcomes that Jillian named? And those we will designate only a pre-HIP. You have provisional approval. And then we're going to spend a few years assessing it for things like learning, persistence, and equity. And only the handful that pass all those tests will actually be called a high impact practice at Cal State Dominguez Hills. I should let you know two other things, and then I'm going to turn you into some breakout discussion groups. First, you may have noticed that I opened with a complaint about the business model and so-called definitions of efficiency that let us scale instruction but lose students. The real efficiency will come if we pay a little bit more for instruction and keep all our students. We are messing with the business model at Cal State Dominguez Hills to disproportionately compensate instruction in high impact practices. Once they get that bright red HIP designation, they qualify for a different kind of recognition of student credit hour and faculty workload. The other thing that I will confess to you, and then send you into the breakout groups, as hard as this looks, it's even harder. You'll spend an awful lot of your time trying to explain to colleagues in other units why they should care, why it's effective, and what makes your program have this kind of impact, because you'll need their help administering it, documenting it, and showing that it's accessible, that it can actually pass all these tests. This is intensely collaborative work. And so with that in mind, we're going to release you now to those breakout groups and ask you to practice your elevator pitch for the high impact practice on your campus that you have the most firsthand familiarity with. And it has to be your own. You can't go describing someone else's because that's a lot easier. For your own, the one you have the most familiarity with. How do you summarize to a colleague, here's what it is, here's the value, and in particular, here's how I know.
All right, how does that look, Helen? Have they all been teleported, or are we still missing some body parts?
Everyone's back now.
All right. Okay, the full teleportation. Well, I'll just say welcome back, everybody. And we want to make a little greater use of the chat here. And if you don't mind, I just put a little welcome back notice in the chat and invited you to just muse for a moment in chat, I hope, about what was hard about this pitch. And you know, was there evidence or information that you had that was important to your story, to your pitch, or that you wish you had? Anybody have any reflections on that? We'd love to get some rolling chat here to reflect on. Well, I'd love to hear your elevator pitches. We probably don't have time for that today. Okay, so we'll kind of do a little audible on a few of these, but hopefully you can all review them yourselves too. Nice to hear that you've got many at JHU. Is it Johns Hopkins? Yeah. How did people do on the evidence? Did you know why you were pitching that one? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe this was a little bit challenging. Okay, let's see. I'm going to try and I'll mention something about Miriam's comment. Student self-reported data. Now, I wouldn't ordinarily pose that as, I'm going to just say that that's the evidence you had, and I'm going to hope that you think that's at least useful evidence. I know some people are not always sure if that's really the main source of evidence, if it's a full and complete and comprehensive source of evidence. And I would probably argue it may not be, but I think there's incredible value to getting students' perspective in this, and then making sure that you can triangulate it, perhaps with other more direct assessments or faculty's estimations of the quality of that experience. But I think to bring that together, to talk about what students' experiences, what they like about it, what makes it satisfying, and then what faculty like about it, and maybe what employers are saying about it, that might be a way to round out that evidence.
The other point that I'd like to emphasize, just because it showed up in the chat, a couple of concessions, but yes, this is hard. Even when you've got a bunch of them, there may be only one that you can adequately explain and describe at this point. That is the case was when we start, but it gets easier with practice. And then the other challenge is the multiple audiences. And I'm really glad that came up because that's kind of the point. Our institutions are so complicated and so it's overused, but siloed in the cultural sense that there's one way of speaking in the Office of Financial Aid that may not resemble the way they talk in residential life, that may not resemble the way they talk in the biology department versus the anthropology department, even if those two are in the same college. And so that sensitivity to different audiences and what pitch will make sense to each one is really the essence of the work. So I'm glad that came up in the chat. It is hard and it is worth our full attention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Any other things you want to comment on, Ken or Randy?
I have one written response to Tekla, who pointed something out right before we went on the break about how hard, about that 4-year grad rate. And so I'll just drop that in writing, but otherwise I'm set, Jillian.
All right. Okay, well, you know, we wanted to at least get you to start to put your head in the game of what does it mean to think about both high impact practices, the quality, their value, and then how do we know that they actually are of value to the student experience. So I know that was a tough exercise perhaps, but I hope it was challenging enough for you to kind of get started in thinking about this. So I'm going to go back to, let's see, I hope sharing my screen here. Let me get back to that. And what I'm going to do now is shift us to another resource that we promised we would promote. I think in the last description where Ken was really describing what was happening at CSU Dominguez Hills, I hope you heard or at least saw in that diagram. Actually, I'll go back to it. Here's the 5-part diagram that Ken was describing has been enacted at Cal State Dominguez Hills to really think about their HIPs, is that this represents the intentional institutional action that CSU DH did to both involve people widely in a task force, to develop a campus-wide track or inventory of practices that are high impact, that they are intentionally thinking about labeling specific high impact practices and then assessing them to make sure that they really are quality and delivering on their promise. And then that whole idea of being a lot more transparent and visible to attract students to high impact practices. So I think these are very much the person who asked, I think it was Brett who asked for strategies and approaches to doing this work. I think what CSU Dominguez Hills is one approach to really kind of getting what might be very siloed, program specific, kind of spread across the campus and in the curriculum and in the co-curriculum activities more coordinated and integrated. So what we want to do now, though, is talk about how some other institutions have acted on this issue of improving the quality and scale of high impact practices. And what we're going to share are some examples from a forthcoming book called Delivering on the Promise of High Impact Practices, where we feature about 20 institutional examples of improving high impact practices. So I'm going to just have the table of contents kind of scroll across here, and you can kind of just get a picture of the variety of chapters that are part of this work. And we're going to highlight 4 that are we think salient to the work that you might be undertaking and helpful as you do this work at the Institute. So I'm gonna start with one of the chapters that is about advancing equity. And it is focused on the work that is occurring in the Thompson Scholars Learning Community Program, this large-scale comprehensive college transition program that kind of straddles the environment of being an orientation and a pre-college transition program, and one that's an extended orientation program that's also a lot like a learning community. So these are students who are admitted into the Thompson Scholars Group, and they are part of a learning community, these tied together coordinated classes and a cohort of students in this experience. Now, while a lot of people would say, well, it's that structure, it's that famous learning community structure where you've cohorted students and you're integrating their coursework and helping them learn more about what it means to learn in community, to learn as a group, to interact with faculty and advisors in intentional ways. And yes, it is all of those things. But what makes this work part of advancing equity as part of the Thompson Scholars Learning Community, and that our colleagues, Adriana Kazar, Ronald Hallett, and Joey Kitchen, and Rosemary Perez studied as formally a part of an evaluation project that they were doing, is how much this experience in the Thompson Scholars, the fact that how they were implemented really made a difference for achieving equity at the institutions. So these are across 3 of the University of Nebraska system institutions. And what they learned is that it was really all about validation, this concept that originated by Laura Rendon, who is a very famous scholar who has studied particularly Latino students and named validation as a really important practice to helping students feel like they're part of an institution, but also as a way for them to really see themselves as scholars and members of an academic community. And what they did in this part of Thompson Scholar was enact the concept of validation. It shaped the way students interacted with each other, how supported they felt in their high impact practice, and how faculty decided to interact with them and how they worked with them. Very intentionally asset-based philosophy and approach, and really spent a lot of time acknowledging how life experiences shape students' academic success. And a little bit more specifically about how that was enacted as part of their high impact practice to make it more equitable is that the Thompson Scholar Program was very choosy about who got to be instructors in this program. They provided a lot of professional development for these faculty and in this case, advisors. They were very intentional about validating norms for teaching that were culturally relevant and validating things like knowing students personally, being accessible, really talking with students about why they needed to interact with their peers and how they were supporting each other's learning in that peer interaction. That they intentionally connected to proactive advising, and they used strength-based tools and identity in their assignments. So students were invited to talk about how they got into this assignment based on their identity and make important identity connections to their assignments. All of that was part of the intentional validation activities that made this high impact practice work to achieve equity. So you can read more about that in Adriana Kizar's chapter with our colleagues from the Thompson Scholar program. So now, Ken, do you want to share, or are you okay with me sharing the next piece on assuring fidelity?
Please do go ahead and share it. Thanks, Jillian. We're going to jump ahead to another chapter, but first I want to drop into the chat a Google Doc where we're hoping that's all right, where we're hoping you'll record some reactions, and in particular, some local either examples or counter examples to the things that Jillian and I are describing from these book chapters. And you'll see when you open up the document that it's got prompts under each. It starts with that central organizing diagram we developed as we were editing the book that you saw on screen a couple of slides ago. And then at the bottom of that first page is the section called Advancing Equity, which has some prompts in italics to the questions posed by the chapter from Adriana Kazar and her writing team. Below that.
Thanks, Ken, for
Sure.
making up for my omission there. I appreciate it. And each one of these we develop prompts for, and I really want to see this as, or I envision this as being an opportunity for reflection. So based on what I just described with what was happening in that mapping the connections of validation chapter, however briefly, I hope it made you think about who's involved in this. How did they foster cross-campus collaborations? What professional development was involved in that? And think about what you might ask or consider in your own practice. So please just record any observation or takeaway from that. Maybe something you're even curious about what they did. That would be very helpful to us. Thanks.
It would. And in that same spirit, I will tell you, we are all figuring this stuff out and learning it together. And so as you're adding to this document, understand you're also making yourself vulnerable to being tracked down by me or by Jillian as we try to figure this stuff out with you. Moving on now to the next of the chapters that we wanted to raise with you here, the sixth one from William Locher and Thea Wolf comes from Cal State University, Chico. And Jillian, you can click ahead, I think, to, that might be the only image on this one. That within the Cal State University system, which is ordinarily what you would expect, a large, urban, very diverse serving institutions on the public dime, Chico is a little different. That picture is not at all misleading. You go there and you feel like you're at a private liberal arts college. Don't know how they pulled it off. It's one of the oldest of the state universities in California. And they are in a remote area. So they also have some advantages when it's time to create a culture, when it's time to build something lasting. They have a greater share of residential students than most of us do. Their faculty come and fall in love with the place and don't move on as quickly. And you'll see in their chapter that if that characterizes the institution where you work too, if you have that kind of stabilizing influence of a steady culture, then there are a few things you can do that they did. Their chapter describes a freshman research experience built into the first year programming offering, and originally co-taught by two academic departments, the Department of English. So this worked for developing freshman composition, but in partnership with the Department of Anthropology. And what do you think was the population studied by all those anthropologists? Yes, the incoming students at CSU Chico. So they're essentially applying the tools of anthropology on themselves, on their friends, and on their faculty and on their staff to figure out, is this a high impact practice? Is it valuable? How do we know? How could we perpetuate it? In other words, they involved the students in that research as part of the freshman learning experience. And then they, after that course design, introduced two other interventions that seemed noteworthy to them. What they call distributed mentoring, where once you have some students in on the behind the scenes thinking, you leave it to them to explain that to other students. So it's all sort of almost like a phone tree. It cascades out across the entire student body as a way of saturating the culture. And then finally, they were very clear that with full respect to autonomy and disciplinary expertise and faculty prerogative, there was still a non-negotiable set of scaffolded assignments that had to be delivered in sync across all the course section deliveries of this course, so that they could make sure that it had that fidelity to the model that seems important when you're implementing high impact practices. So that's it for my summary of chapter 6, Jillian. I'll turn it to you next, but just remind people those three characteristics of their intervention: course design, distributed mentoring, and scaffolded assignment sequence. I'm very interested in whether any of you participating in this session have examples like that from your own institutions that this reminds you of. Jillian?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. All right, so the third example we want to draw is actually one that we think is a great demonstration of achieving scale. So the idea that we want to make HIPS more widespread, and we want to provide more occasions for people to know where they are in the curriculum and the co-curriculum, and to know what evidence we have of their value. The example that I'm going to illustrate actually comes from the University of South Carolina. And this is in a chapter that was authored by Pam Bowers and Laura Ducate. And Pam and Laura describe what the University of South Carolina has been doing now for a very long period of time. They've been at this activity of documenting what goes on, what they call beyond the classroom, in a comprehensive student record system. It's a supplemental student information system called Beyond the Classroom Matters, BTCM. And what this is designed to do is document HIPs that are co-curricular events and activities. And it's the whole idea, many of you might be familiar with this really old concept of a co-curricular transcript. That's how I came to know it more than 25 years ago. But they have really done it this time. It's not just an imagining, but they've really done it. That is a formal system where students, that is providing a permanent record of student involvement, and it links to students' academic records. Now, what's notable about this is the care that they've taken to assuring that the kinds of experiences that are documented in the Beyond the Classroom Matters are of quality, and that they are delivering on the outcomes that we know are important. And they are using this system to monitor the continuous achievement of these outcomes. So they have it so that students who are involved in high impact practices, in particular those that are part of the co-curriculum, are recorded, and they are able to track and document who participates them and what their outcomes are. So whether those outcomes are retention, term to term, or graduation, or other learning outcomes that are now being built into their process, are really an important part of their project. And the idea of encouraging greater institutional reflection on the qualities that South Carolina has identified as associated with what counts as a high impact practice is probably one of the most in-depth aspects of this. So they have essentially what would be described as a rubric for each of their high impact practices that are part of this, the Beyond the Classroom Matters record keeping system. And they're able to go in and constantly monitor whether the HIPs are delivering on those outcomes. And it not only provides a way for people designing these experiences to know what the criteria are, but then to provide evidence about how those criteria are being achieved. So it's really done a lot to both track and document where HIPs exist in the student experience, but also as a measure to ensure quality and make sure that they were designing with the quality dimensions in mind from the start, and that the institution was continuing to track on those outcomes. And to me, this is really key to thinking about scale, is what's the institutional action, the committees that need to be involved in both defining and creating criteria, and determining how do we scale these? How do we make them more visible? How do we make them trackable in our institutional systems? And I would love to get any ideas, reactions, takeaways to the University of South Carolina's example on the Google Doc. If there's, again, a question that you have, or if there's something that you're already doing that you think might lend itself to this, we'd love to hear about it. Perhaps there already is an effort on your own campus that might allow you to track something in the same way. We have a couple of other chapters in the Achieving Scale section of the book that talk about institutions that put identifiers, tags. They essentially tagged all the HIPs that are part of their formal curriculum, where they exist in general education and where they exist in the major. So there are lots of ways to think about how to spread scale, but the South Carolina one is really very aspirational in my mind, in terms of making the scale of HIPs not only more visible, trackable, but also useful for gathering evidence about their value to an undergraduate experience.
That's great. Thank you, Jillian. One other thing about the South Carolina model that I'll emphasize before you jump to the next slide, from Pam Bowers in particular, who is, I think, VP in Student Affairs but it's a different kind of, I don't think she's just VP Student Affairs. I think she's got a title that also talks about assessment or data. She is very eloquent on data as a shared common resource. And increasingly, I think of it as the lingua franca as we try to look for these integrative forces to overcome the general centrifugal tendencies of our higher ed organizations. That if we can get people, it may come down to data governance, believe it or not, what it is we do to better integrate ourselves in the service of student learning. Go ahead and click to the next one, please. Thank you. So this chapter 16 from Slippery Rock University, if you buy the premise that our data has more value than we recognized, the next step is to elevate people's consciousness. And we've been starting to do that at Dominguez Hills in every corner we can think of. If you think about it, most of the staff at your institution who file expense claims, think of it as, this is a transaction, I need to get my boss repaid. Most of the people in the registrar think, this is a transaction, I need to get this petition resolved. But what they're now doing, and didn't necessarily do at the beginning of their careers, is creating the data archive. Those keystrokes, that budget number, the account code that you put in is suddenly used now and queried out of big data warehouses to tell us what are the patterns of resource allocation at the institution. That's relatively new, and they may not realize that what they're doing is suddenly much higher stakes than it was back when they were trained to do it. The same thing is true for teaching and learning, right? The faculty members who teach these classes are thinking, how do I get my student up to the proficiency that I want, without realizing that the techniques we apply, the different names we give these different educational experiences, are now accumulating an institutional record set of value. And what they did at Slippery Rock was what you see hinted at in the question that Brett Einen posed in the chat. They have leveraged the Office of Faculty Development as a site of data governance. They worked with faculty from across disciplines to regularize their understanding of what are these high impact practices? What do those 8 qualities look like? Not for the whole country, but just here at Slippery Rock University. What do we mean when we say frequent feedback? How do we know that's what we mean? And what do we call it when it's valuable feedback, but it doesn't pass this test? So now it needs a different label. That's very hard work. And what I love about this chapter is how candid it is. They must have tried 3 different ways to regularize their definitions. And it started from, as Brad Wilson puts it, a pretty onerous sort of star chamber compliance approach. You will do this or you will be banned from calling it a high impact practice. And it didn't work. It just made people hate dealing with them. And so they just said, stop. Let's make this instead about shared learning, about professional development, about mutual respect for each other's scholarship. And it tipped. It really made a difference at that university. And I think the end we just heard about at South Carolina with Pam Bowers and the institution-wide data governance, learning and faculty will be left behind in that effort unless you think about it in connection with this work at Slippery Rock around where is the data governance angle in teaching and learning and how can we promulgate it. And it does seem like it's that Office of Faculty Professional Development or the Center for Teaching and Learning, whatever it's called at your campus, that seems to be the location where we can get ourselves a little bit more on the same page for the sake of fidelity and scaling high impact practices. And as you heard Jillian say at the start of this presentation, equity is soaked into all of those. We don't believe we're going to finish delivering on those promises unless we can get the fidelity, get the scaling, get the assessment all working together. And it's only then that we see these gaps start to erode.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, I hope this gives you some flavor and hope for what institutions can do. You know, there's no shortage of great examples about how this works. And I I think, I realize some of you might be holding back on promoting your own efforts, but I know there's a really good audience here. And I suspect many of you have fabulous undergraduate research programs or learning communities that you would want to tout as well. And I hope there's an occasion to do that. And we would really love to hear about them as well. And again, though, I think there are many examples in both this publication and that we can find pretty readily that we've been studying for some time now of places that have really taken it to the next level to assure fidelity in terms of the quality of the experience, who have spent time assessing the outcomes to make sure that we haven't lost some of the sharpness in our hips. I think that's a very important thing to do periodically, and that we are thinking about how to make them more widespread. The idea of pulling those three things together to advance equity, to me, is what this diagram that we kind of use to describe how the pieces fit together in this publication. All the chapters address all four of these dimensions, but each one emphasizes the route to delivering on the promise in a slightly different way or a sharper way. And we tried to highlight the few today that did that through fidelity and scale. So with that, I'm hoping there might be a question or two lingering in the audience here that maybe we can, I see Randy posed a question. Right, I'm going to stop sharing, so maybe we can go back to seeing everyone. Or even dare open mics if somebody has a question. All right, who wants to take Randy's question, the hard one about costs or resources, enter into the analysis?
I'd like to start just because it is curiously part of my own portfolio here at Dominguez Hills. Which I find bizarre. When I was at the chancellor's office all those years, I was a notorious profligate. I would raise all this grant money. I would spend more than I had raised. I would go ask my bosses to cover the difference. I would raise more grant money. And it was all to advance high impact practices. And then I came here and they said, Ken, you're in charge of the budget. And it's like, are you kidding me? You guys are going to sink the university. But I do have sort of the keys to the institutional data about credit hours, workload, and tuition. And that point that Randy is making about flattening the cost curve haunts us. My worry with our book is all of this good work, unless we somehow incorporate it into the business model, will simply erode over time, like the good work of our predecessors from 20 and 30 years ago. They would get excited about innovations. The erosion of our business model of credit hours, of interchangeable courses would come along, and all of that grant-funded, passionate work from individual advocates would just go away when the person retired. And I do worry that that's our fate unless we figure out how to answer Randy's question about the flattening the cost curve. We have two ways to do that. And I'm not persuaded that either one is the right one, but it's what we're trying. One is to change the discussion so that we're not funding enrollment, but we're funding completion. That's been tried many times over the decades. It has a bad name, especially among left-leaning people. It can sound a little bit libertarian, like you sit on your own, your bottom sits on its own, whatever that phrase is, you know what it is, where you only get paid if the student graduates. And yet that helps us argue that interventions like high impact practices that add to completion pay for themselves, even though the cost of instruction up front is higher. But that's a rhetorical change as well as a change to the business model. The other change that we're working on here, also very much a work in progress. There are in our business records, and I don't know if this is universal in higher education, but I know it's universal in the California State University. These things called workload factors that let you translate 3 credit hours into something other than 3 workload units for the faculty. You can adjust that ratio up or down. It doesn't have to be 1-to-1. Very few people have tampered with that ratio, but it does exist in our institutional records. And it seems like the kind of committee structure I described that says what is and is not a high impact practice could eventually get permission to say, if you teach with high impact practices, instead of having a 4-4 load, you have a 4-3 load, because we know that that much more work is involved. And I think if we can both build it into performance-based funding or completion-based funding and build it into the workload model and have that regular feedback of assessment that says when it is and isn't happening, then we have at least the chance that this would survive past the current generation of educators, that we would actually have made a permanent change to the business model. Sorry, long answer, but a complicated question, Randy.
Yeah, Kelly had a good question about length and short-term experiences, and I responded in the chat, but I'll just say we should be investigating shorter-term kinds of experiences for all of these things, whether they're micro internships or short-term study away, domestic study abroad, or study away, I think it's called. But there are a lot of variations on this work that don't commit us or rely on a whole semester or a lot of costly investments by the student. There can be some real value to micro HIPs and some other experiences that are shorter term. And I think that's really key to equity. I think one of the major factors in some of the inequitable participation has to do with cost and time. Right, anything else?
We have, in the 60 seconds left, I would like to jump in and just thank our hosts and also you folks for participating. Attrition was very low for this session, and I appreciate that. I'm glad you stuck with it the whole time. And I would really love to stay in touch with you and hear, like, since you stuck it out, I can tell it's an area of interest for you too, and I would just love to stay in touch with you.
And just one reminder, I forgot to note this too, there is a comprehensive reference list at the bottom of that Google Doc. So you may want to download the Google Doc for that reason alone. We compiled all the references from the book. So if you're looking for the most comprehensive references on HIPs, this is it.